Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to RJ Julia. We're happy that so many of you have come to our event this evening. I'm Michael, event host with RJ Julia. We're joined tonight by Tom Santopietro in support of his new book, The Way We Were. After a brief introduction, we'll hear from Tom. We'll have some time later for questions from the audience. And then immediately after the event, we can move into the other room. We'll have a book signing if you'd like to meet or talk to Tom also and get your book signed. The Way We Were, the making of a romantic classic, just in time for the 50th anniversary of the film's release. This behind-the-scenes account features new insights from Barbra Streisand, James Woods, and more, providing the definitive inside story behind the challenges and creative passions of those who fought to make this landmark film. Tom Santopietro is the author of 8 previous books. Tom's books have been featured in the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, The Atlantic, Boston Globe, and numerous newspapers across the country. Tom has made multiple television and radio appearances, forums ranging from National Public Radio to Inside Edition and Voice of America. One additional interesting fact about Tom, he's a graduate of the University of Connecticut School of Law. Tom emerged with a firm resolution never to practice law. Prior to becoming an author, Tom worked as a tennis pro. He spent 25 years as a manager of over 30 Broadway shows. And now, Tom Santopietro. Bill, to check, can you hear okay in the back?
Yeah.
Okay.
First, thanks everybody for coming out because, it's a Tuesday night in January and I really appreciate people coming. I have to say right off it's so nice to do these things and see familiar faces. My cousin Marcy is here tonight. I do have law school classmates here tonight who can vouch for my horrific career in law school. It's a miracle I graduated. And the funny thing is, the lectern makes me think of law school, and I really have this sense memory of the teacher standing up there, and of course I wasn't paying attention. And Mr. Santopietro, what's the weakness in this line of reasoning? And I'm like, I don't know. He didn't like Barbra Streisand. I wasn't. So. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. And so I thought I would start talk very briefly about why I wrote the book, and then kind of walk you through some of the book and the history of the film, which is the behind the scenes stories that were so interesting, and then just a few reasons why I think we're still talking about this particular film 50 years later. The reason why I started to think about the film is because it is one of those movies that people obsess over, and they don't just like, but they return to over and over again. And I overheard 2 women who were reenacting the final scene of the film for themselves. Oh, your girl is lovely. And I'm like, what? What's going on? And that just really interested me because they loved the movie so much. And then I happened to catch a rerun of Sex and the City where they reenact the scene in front of the plaza, and they're talking about the movie and quoting the dialogue. So I thought, oh, there's something going on here. And then I finally realized that if I wrote about The Way We Were, it would complete my trilogy of books about films that people obsess over, because I wrote about The Godfather, the drama, The Sound of Music, a musical, and now The Way We Were, a romance. So for all of those reasons, I really wanted to kind of dive into it. And the more I was researching, the more interested I became in the backstory of the film and why it speaks to us. And the Way We Were came about because the producer, Ray Stark, who had produced Funny Girl for Barbra, he had made a lot of money on 2 movies with Barbra Streisand. He wanted to make another movie with her. And he went to Arthur Lawrence, this screenwriter, and he said to Arthur, I want you to write a movie for Barbra. I'm going to produce it. And it was kind of Ray Stark, but Arthur Lawrence admitted he signed on board for a really cockamamie idea that made no sense at all. Just think of this. With the success of The Sound of Music in mind, Ray Stark decided that a great movie for Barbra Streisand would be if Barbara played a Brooklyn school teacher who taught blind children how to sing. And so you have to picture Barbra Streisand as Brooklyn's answer to Maria von Trapp. So Arthur Lawrence was literally walking over to meet with Barbara to discuss it, and he thought to himself, this is not just a bad idea, it's a horrible idea. And he knew that Barbara, who's pretty blunt, would knock this out of the park right away. So when he was chatting with her, he thought, and he knew her because he had directed her in her first Broadway show when she was a teenager. And as they were talking, this is how these films come about, which interests me so much. He thought, who does she remind me of now? What's my sense memory? And he thought, oh yeah, it's that classmate of mine from Cornell, a woman who was very politically active. She headed the Young Communist League, and Barbara is famously political. This woman talked fast the way Barbara does. And then kind of the light bulb went off because the classmate's name came back to him, and her name was Fanny Price with a P, one letter from Fanny Bryce, funny girl. And Ray Stark was Fanny Bryce's son-in-law. So it all kind of came together. Arthur Lawrence wrote a treatment very quickly that Ray Stark loved, and then they sent the treatment to Barbara. And Barbara started reading it, and so I had this really interesting written correspondence with Barbara as research for the film, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. And Barbara said that as she was reading the treatment, what popped into her head was the director David Lean, Lawrence of Arabia, one of the all-time great directors. He said, if you read a treatment and there are 5 good scenes in the treatment, that's the sign that you want to make the movie. And Barbara wrote to me and she said there were more than 5 good scenes in this treatment. So she knew right away she was going to sign on. And then the next question was, who's going to direct? And Arthur Lawrence came up with the idea of Sidney Pollack because They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Had just been released to great acclaim. And Arthur Lawrence suggested Sidney Pollack. He came to rue the day he suggested it because they really fought during the filming. But we can talk about that later. And Barbara liked the idea of Sidney Pollack because he was connected to the neighborhood playhouse in New York. So that gave him real cred in her mind. And also Sidney Pollack, Ray Stark liked the idea that Sidney Pollack was very friendly with Robert Redford. They had made 2 films together already. So they brought the treatment to Robert Redford and he hated it. He did not like it at all. And he said, there's no way I'm making this movie. But they knew they wanted him. So Sidney Pollack just badgered him. And Redford kept saying no. And the reason why was because he said the movie is entirely for her. She has all the good scenes. This is a cardboard character who runs around saying, Katie, Katie, Katie for 2 hours. And I'm not playing that role. But Pollack went to work on it. And there's a really interesting letter, a lengthy letter that Pollack wrote to Redford. And he said, you need to do this movie. You're a big star after Butch Cassidy, but you need to establish yourself as a romantic lead. Because Butch Cassidy was not a romance, and neither was Jeremiah Johnson, as another big film. And Redford still didn't want to do it. Ray Stark got mad because everything was being held up. And Ray Stark said to Sidney Pollack, go over to Redford's apartment tonight. You get an answer, yes or no from him, and that's it. And so he went over, he's talking to Redford. Ray Stark calls on the phone and says, what's the answer? And Sidney Pollack said, I need more time. And Ray Stark said, no, you don't. Ryan O'Neal's going to star in the movie. That's the end of the discussion. And Pollack said, no, I want more time. And finally, he just kind of browbeat Robert Redford into doing the movie. And Robert Redford said he did it because he trusted Sidney Pollack. And he was a little uneasy about Barbara in a dramatic role. You know, he obviously respected her talent, but her movies have been musicals or comedies, but he signed on. And so they start filming, and they go to the college campus, and the first couple choices were not available. And so they start filming at Union College in New York. And then here was another, this is just a story of how these films come together. This was the very first film of the actor James Woods, whom we all know now, you know, Emmy Awards and Academy Award nominations, but he was a complete unknown then. And he had a very small role as Barbara's college boyfriend. And so there's a scene coming up where Barbara is in the library, you know, kind of salivating over Robert Redford's character because she's in love with him, and they're very opposite. She's this abrasive, political, highly charged woman, but she's such a good and dynamic figure, and Redford's the golden boy. You know, everything comes so easily to him. And the scene was Barbara looking at Redford in the library. It's all silent with kind of longing. And so James Woods thinks about this, and he goes up to Sidney Pollack because he wants to be in the scene. These are how people get noticed. It's so interesting to me. And James Woods goes up to Sidney Pollack and he says, "You know that scene in the library?" And Sidney Pollack's response was, "You mean that scene between the two biggest movie stars in the world that you're not in?" And so then James Woods goes over to Barbara and he said, "Barbara, you know that scene in the library?" And she says, "You mean the scene between Bob and me?" And he says, "Yes, but the point of that scene is we're establishing how much you long for the Redford character. And since I play your boyfriend, wouldn't it be a lot more interesting if I'm in the scene and I'm eyeing you while you're eyeing Redford? Wouldn't that give it dramatic heft?" And Barbara thought about it, and then she turned and she said, "Sidney, the kid's in the scene." And that's how he got noticed, totally by chutzpah on his own part. And I had a really interesting, long phone interview with James Woods. And he said that Redford and Streisand, they really were the biggest stars in the world at that point, and that they both were incredibly nice to him, that they actually took time with him. And and it was really the launching pad for his career. He said he has a very sort of soft spot in his heart for the film. So the filming continues, and what emerges right away is that Barbara and Redford perfectly reflect as people the differences between their characters. And it was reflected in their acting styles. Barbara wanted to rehearse every single scene over and over and over and try different things. And Redford was much more, he was about improvisation. He was much more laid back. California, she was rat-a-tat-tat, New York. You know, out of these complete opposite personalities, the sparks of the romance, everybody thought, "Oh, this is great," because the actors are reflecting the characters. And so they are starting to develop a rapport. Hold on one second, because I have to, this is sort of reflective of how disorganized I was in law school. But I didn't even know what case we were discussing. I have to switch the page here. Oops. So as the filming progresses, they're getting along very well. The real problem came with Arthur Lawrence, the writer. Now, Arthur Lawrence was a big name writer. He had written the musicals West Side Story and Gypsy. He wrote the Alfred Hitchcock movie Rope, you know, but he was a man of very, very strong opinions, outspoken. And Redford had signed on for the film under the assurance from Pollock that other writers would be brought in and provide rewrites, which obviously Lawrence didn't like, but what he really didn't like was they brought on no fewer than 11 different screenwriters, 11, and including Francis Ford Coppola at one point. And what made Lawrence so mad was that a lot of the incidents in the screenplay were taken from his own life. So he had 11 people rewriting his life. And it got so contentious that eventually Ray Stark fired Arthur Lawrence. Lawrence figured he was done with the film. And then a little bit later, Ray Stark called him up and said, there are so many problems with the screenplay with so many writers. We need you to come back and fix it. So Lawrence came back and he said, yeah, I'll do it for a lot of money. He made extra money. So they continue on that and they finish filming. They do the location work and then they do all the interiors on the West Coast. And they start thinking about, what are we going to do for music for this film? It's a period piece. We need to establish the mood. And so Ray Stark comes up with the idea that he's going to have Marvin Hamlisch write the score. Now, Marvin Hamlisch was not the famous Marvin Hamlisch we all know who wrote Chorus Line. He was still basically unknown. He had scored only one film. And Ray Stark, being the smart operator he was, called up Marvin Hamlisch and said, I want you to write a title song for this movie. And he starts describing it as a period piece. And he says to Marvin, I want you to write this on spec, meaning you're going to write a song and I'm not going to pay you for it unless I like it. And Marvin Hamlisch said, well, why would I do that for free? And Ray Stark said, because if you do that and I like the song, you're going to be able to score the entire movie. I'll pay you, and the song is for Barbra Streisand. And Marvin Hamlisch said, I'm in. So he works for 3 weeks. He has a hard time coming up with the melody, and then he finally hits on the theme that we all know. And he brings it to the Bergmans, Alan and Marilyn Bergman. They write the lyric, and then D-Day arrives because D-Day is they audition the song for Barbra Streisand, whom they all know. And that's when it became, I loved researching and finding this stuff out because it became, as you know, a Grammy-winning #1 hit around the world. And Barbara listens to the song and she says, I like this. I have 2 suggestions. And this is why she is so smart. She said, Marvin, in the 3rd line of the melody, you're going down. I need you to push it up so my voice can lift with that. And then she says to the Bergmans, you're starting the song with daydreams like the corners of my mind. The whole movie is about memories. How about if you start it with memories like the corners of my mind? And with those 2 suggestions, it became the way we were. So they're thrilled. Barbra Streisand likes the song. And on the way home, Alan Bergman says, she's not going to record the song for 3 months. Let's write another version of the song. And Marvin Hamlisch says, why would we do that? She likes the song. And Marilyn says, the title's so great. We can go in so many directions and we don't just write for them. We write for ourselves. Let's do another song. So they do another song. It's a really good song. They play it for Barbara. Barbara loves the second song. And here's how they decide what's going to become the theme that we all know. Barbara records each song, but just with a piano. They make a cassette because they still had cassettes in those days. And on this little tinny cassette player, they play each version of the song against the footage of the movie where the song is going to be heard. And it was unanimous. They all realized that even though the second song was complex and kind of beautiful, that the first song worked better with the footage of the film. And if you ever want to hear the second song, go to YouTube. Barbara did it once in concert. She called it The Way We Weren't. It's actually a great song, but the first one works better with the film. So they are at this point, they've, finished filming, they've scored, and it's time for the sneak previews. And in the sneak previews, they, Stark and Pollock are kind of in the back, and it's going great, and the audience is loving it. And then 2/3 of the way through, they lose the audience. The audience gets up, they're going to get popcorn, they're going to have a smoke, because people could still smoke then in movie theaters, and they've lost the audience. And they realized that what had happened was that's when the politics, the blacklist background had come to the fore, and the love story had receded. So overnight, because there was a preview the next night, they were in San Francisco, they went to Francis Ford Coppola's editing bay, and with a razor blade, because they didn't have the right equipment, they literally scissored out 10 minutes of the political sequences. They just chopped it out overnight. They play the movie the next night. The audience loves it. There's a much better response. The only person who's unhappy is Marvin Hamlish, because Marvin Hamlish made a really big mistake. And he admitted it. He said that he was so afraid of overusing the theme song that he said, I'm not using it during the final scene. When they break up for good, they are not going to hear this song. And he watched it and he realized nobody was crying. He wanted the tears. And so he knew he had to have the song heard again. So he went to Columbia Pictures, who were releasing the film. And he said, I need to record another 90 seconds. We're going to hear the theme again. And they said, no, we're not. We're not paying for that. You're an unknown. We're not doing that. And he said he was calling their bluff. He said, well, then, okay, I'll pay for it myself, the 60 musicians. And they said, knock yourself out. Go pay for it. So he did. And he recorded it. You heard the song again, and he said at the next preview, he heard the audience crying, and he knew it had been the right decision to spend that money. So it's all these little accidents that make this film really work. And they released the film, I should add, during all of this, Arthur Lawrence, the outspoken Arthur Lawrence, they show him a rough cut, right, when not everything has been completed. And it makes such fascinating reading. To research, I went to the Library of Congress in DC because they have Arthur Lawrence's papers. And it was just such a fun thing to, first of all, to be at the Library of Congress was really great. And then to see these handwritten notes. All his papers are there, lengthy letters he wrote to Angela Lansbury or whoever it was. And in all the files on The Way We Were, this is when it sort of made my eyes pop. Arthur Lawrence was not pleased with the rough cut. Only his way of not being pleased, he didn't just write a polite letter and say, gee, I wish you would re-edit it. He wrote an 8-page single-spaced typed memo where he's saying things to Ray Stark like, what you did to my screenplay makes me sick to my stomach. How could you do this to me? And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. But, they recut, they rescored. The film opens for the critics. And the critical reception, looking back on it 50 years later, is really interesting because the reviews of the film itself are mixed. They praise the stars, but all the chopped out political sequences made the film choppy in the last 1/3. And, you don't really understand why the two of them break up. You think it's because he had a one-night stand with another woman, but it's really because their political differences had come to a head. And that's the stuff that's on the cutting room floor. But the reviews were praising the two stars enormously. And so the prediction was that the film would open big, and then the box office would fall off, only it never fell off. And people kept coming, and they would come over and over and over again. And it grew into this enormous, enormous hit. And so it was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. And it won 2. It won Best Song and it won Best Score. Barbara was nominated as Best Actress, and she lost to Glenda Jackson for a movie called A Touch of Class. And as I said, being a wise guy, when was the last time any of you said, I can't wait to watch A Touch of Class again? But this we're talking about 50 years later. And so I just want to talk a little bit more about the reasons why I think the film is such a huge success. Oh, I should just tell you a little bit about the exchange with Barbara, because that was really interesting. My first book was about Barbra Streisand. It was called The Importance of Being Barbara. And that was 17 years ago. All of you, I'm sure, are very good at math. And of course, I was 22 when I wrote that book. Do the math. And I sort of wanted to see, what it was like to look at the same figure again, almost 20 years later, and to talk about this film again. And so getting to Barbra Streisand, it's like it would be easier to break into Fort Knox. Really. And I'm used to dealing with stars because of working on Broadway, but this is an entirely different level of stardom. There are agents, there are managers, there are press agents, there are music people, there are movie people, there are East Coast people, there are West Coast people. And so, but I got to her manager and he said, put your questions in writing and I will get them to Barbara's office. And so I thought a long time about the questions because I knew I could not write a question like, did you like Robert Redford? That was not going to go over well. And so I thought a long time about the questions. I wrote them out, and the story I tell to make fun of myself is that it was August of last year, and it was one of those New York summer days where it was 95 degrees, it was 90% humidity, and I was in a really bad mood because I had just spent, no exaggeration, 2.5 hours in the dentist chair for part 3 of my second root canal. So I was in a bad mood, and I stopped in the shade to look at my email on my phone, and it said, for Thomas Santopietro from Barbra Streisand. Wow. And I was, I did kind of one of those triple takes. And what was so interesting about it was she answered every one of my questions with a very detailed paragraph-long answer. And I thought, this is why she is who she is, because every word matters to her. And you could tell she had gone through it so carefully. These are events from 50 years ago. She had total recall of it. And then she wanted to know exactly how I was going to use her answers in the text of my book. And I had no problem with that. I didn't want her to think she was misquoted. I wasn't going to give her approval over the book, obviously, and I had many lengthy conversations with her representatives going over every word. And I thought, what I really thought was, this is why she became one of the very leading interpreters of Stephen Sondheim, because she's the example of the Sondheim's famous dictum, God is in the details, and every detail mattered to her. So that's a lengthy sidelight, but it's Barbara, and it's worth talking about her because she's the star of this movie. And she said, this movie really matters to me. It's one of the best experiences of my career. She wanted everything to be perfectly accurate. So the last things that I just want to talk about are really the why behind the success, because that was something I wanted to analyze. I wanted to tell the fun behind the scenes story of James Woods getting himself into the scene and hearing from Barbara. But what interests me is why do people go to this particular romantic film over and over again? Because it's referenced, as I said, in Sex and the City. It was repeatedly referenced in Gilmore Girls. It was on Saturday Night Live a lot. It's a real cultural reference point. And so there are several reasons, I think, for why it still works in that sense. It's an uneven film because of the political sequences, but the romance really works like gangbusters. I think the first reason is because it is a story of opposites. They are opposites as characters, they're opposites as personalities, as actors, and out of those differences, sparks fly. And I say in the book that in all of Redford's other kind of romantic movies, whether he was opposite Meryl Streep or Lena Olin or Jane Fonda or Michelle Pfeiffer, none of them had the sparks that this one does. This is the one we remember. And so it's the attraction of opposites. The movie works because the music is terrific, and it kind of sweeps across the screen. It's like this romantic uplift, and it blends with the cinematography, which is really great. I really know this film sort of frame by frame now, and you can see how smart they were about how they shot it and to make it look glamorous. And the cinematographer, a guy named Harry Stradling Jr., he was so smart. He talked about how to film her outdoors as opposed to indoors, and he got his tips from his father, who had filmed her for her first 3 movies, including Funny Girl. So that was kind of fun to discover. The ending when they part in front of the Plaza Hotel, that's the scene everybody remembers. It's a killer. It works on every single level. But I think my own personal feeling is that the single biggest reason why the film works and why we talk about it is because it is about loving the wrong person. And everybody, male or female, has loved the wrong person at some point in their lives. It doesn't matter if it was for a long time or a short time, but everybody has. And I mentioned this theory to my friend Janine Basinger. Some of you may know of. She's a terrific writer and film historian and scholar. And Janine had the perfect answer. She said to me, "Tom, you're right. It is the story of loving the wrong person. That's why it works. Everybody in life has loved the wrong person, male or female." And then she said, "Except for maybe 10 people, and who wants to know them?" I think, so just the final 2 things, and then if anybody has questions. I think it's easy to dismiss films that are romantic at heart as not having substance, but there is substance in this film. And I think, the character of Hubble, the Redford character, there's a terrific scene when they're still in college, and he has written a short story, and it's chosen as the best one. Nobody expected that, the golden boy could write like that. And the dialogue from that story is so great. And I have to read it so I get it for you, but it illuminates the characters. And what he's writing in the story is, he says, and obviously it's about himself, in a way, he was like the country he lived in. Everything came too easily to him, but at least he knew it. About once a month, he worried that he was a fraud. And that really stuck with me. I think there's substance to it. And the last thing I am is a Shakespearean scholar, but there's this, it reminded me instantly of the great line in Cymbeline. And it's, golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers come to dust. And that's the story of the Hubble Gardeners of the world. And it made me think of my parents' generation, the greatest generation, when this movie is set. And they, are very few of them left now. And I think the final thing is to me, Hubble is like a character out of an F. Scott Fitzgerald short story. And Fitzgerald had this great phrase, and he talks about the golden hour. And it's the moment when everything comes together, your professional life with your personal life. And it's sort of, you achieve peace and happiness, and you try to pin it down. And as you grow older, you think about if you have been lucky enough to achieve the golden hour, you think about it. You're thinking about the way we were. And it is impossible to pin it down, but trying to is a part of life, and it's a really great part of life. And I think for all of those reasons, it's what underpins and underscores this movie and why it works. So I'm going to stop there, and if anybody has questions.
Yeah, let's go with 2 questions.
Okay.
We want to make sure everybody has time to get the book
Yeah.
signed
Okay.
and talk to Tom also. But yeah, let's go with 2
Yeah.
questions.
So was Robert Redford ultimately glad he joined the movie?
The question is, was Redford glad he joined the movie? And absolutely. He realized, first of all, it made him really then the biggest star in the world, because it came out right before his version of The Great Gatsby, and The Sting was at the same time. So it put him #1. He also had developed a great relationship and friendship with Streisand, and he looks back on that very fondly. And one thing I talk about in the book is when he receives his Career Achievement Awards, because he's gotten everyone going now. Jane Fonda speaks on his behalf and others, but it's always Barbara who has the star moment of presenting him with the award. That their bond is still there.
Wow.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
So Tom, I have a question about the second song, The Way We Were, because I've heard it, I've heard Streisand do it in that live concert. Do you know if anyone else has recorded it? And if not, was that because it, like, some rights associated with the movie?
The question was about the second version of the song, and I don't know of anybody else that recorded it. I had a really fun interview with the lyricist, Alan Bergman, at age 97, and who was terrific and had great recall of everything. And I think I was talking to Billy Stritch, who is Liza Minnelli's, conductor and pianist. And Billy said, I know that song. It's a great song, but I don't think he's ever recorded it. He just knows it. So it's worth going to YouTube, because it's a really great song. And Barbara describes it as very French. Yeah.
Met Barbara Streisand. They were very good friends.
Very good friends. The Bergmans had a relationship with Barbara going back to the New York days. Yes, absolutely. And Marvin knew Barbara because he had been the rehearsal pianist for Funny Girl on Broadway. And so, but they had not, spent a lot of time together. And he said and this was in an interview years later, he said, I was still really nervous auditioning the song for her, because if she didn't like it, he'd know in 12 seconds flat, but she really liked it a lot. Yeah. Yeah, so
Thank you. Will everyone please join us?
thanks for coming.
And any additional questions? I'm sure everybody has lots more they'd like to talk about. But let's exactly. Yeah, the books we've got at the front register. It's in the other room. We'll make a line and I'll be signing books.